Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty, a special episode this week with Congressman Thomas Massie. Only Congress has the right to declare war. Check it out. Congressman Massie, welcome back.
Thanks for having me on, Matt.
Friend of the show. I see you're blessing us. You're wearing your official Precious button today.
I'm wearing Precious. It's all for you, though, Matt.
Now, if you take that off, will you disappear? No, it's the opposite.
It's the opposite,
It's
yeah.
the opposite.
The cops can't see me when I wear it.
Yeah.
It doesn't really affect you.
But you're, potentially you'll become more and more corrupt as this show goes on if you keep it on for too long.
Yes, this will happen. I'll go to detox after the show.
Well, this is either a really good time or a really bad time to do this show because you just came from the House floor. Nancy Pelosi had late votes, and we're in the midst of debating Iran and the use of force. And there was a vote tonight. Tell me what happened and how you voted.
So the resolution we voted on tonight, and I did just come from the floor, was a resolution ostensibly to invoke the War Powers Act of 1973 that says, that the president can only do so much and he can't go to war without an act of Congress. And this was basically a restatement of that. It was somewhat redundant. But I think it was important to have the vote. Now, in order for the vote to carry weight, it would also have to pass the Senate. The House bill tonight was a concurrent resolution. The one they're working on in the Senate is called a joint resolution. And don't get excited, it's not about marijuana. It's just Senate joint resolution. So the difference between a concurrent resolution, which is the House bill, and the joint resolution, which is the Senate bill that Kane has written and Mike Lee and Rand Paul support, is that a joint resolution has to pass both chambers, and then it's signed by the president and has the force of law. The House version was a concurrent resolution, so there's some debate over whether it really means anything because it also has to pass the Senate, but it doesn't even go to the president's desk. He can't even veto it. But it's what the War Powers Act of 1973 calls for as concurrent resolution. But there's been a Supreme Court case, 1983, Chadha, INS versus Chadha. It says you can't give powers to the president and then veto them without presenting them to the president for a chance to veto. So boiling all of this down, it was mostly a symbolic vote over whether the president can go to war in Iran without Congress.
So a clear statement from the House, but not with the teeth
right.
that the Senate is trying to do.
Right. The Senate version, if it comes to the House and we vote for that, has real teeth. It's not debatable in the Supreme Court or in any court. And then it would go to the president. But the problem with that one is he's going to veto it. And there aren't enough votes in the House, probably not in the Senate either, to sustain a veto. So this isn't going to prevail.
Sure.
But there was a lot of debate today on this bill.
Yeah.
One of the important aspects of the bill that changed, just today it changed, because of my colleague Matt Gaetz, who was one of three Republicans, along with me and Rooney, who voted for this, mostly, Democrat resolution. Matt Gaetz insisted that they take out any criticism of the president, the current president, and his actions toward Soleimani. And it was a smart thing to do. A lot of Republicans rightfully said in the debate today that the Democrats are only doing this to score political points. And it's true. It is true. They said the timing of it is proof. And that is true, too. But to them, I would say, I've been with you guys in the majority for 6 years, and you never brought this stuff up. Like, if you're complaining about the timing now of debating war powers of Congress versus the president, I'm not going to be sympathetic to that. And also, if the Democrats instantly found their anti-war religion again, I don't care how they got to the foot of the cross. If it took an orange man to lead them there, they're back at the foot of the anti-war, cross. And so let's pray with them and let's stop the next war.
Well, it is that you're describing this somewhat toothless expression of the House wanting to reacquire their authority to declare war, and it reminds me, and this may be a bad comparison, but it reminds me a little bit of impeachment because it was so urgent, and it was a constitutional crisis, and the House had to act, but they're still sitting on that. They haven't sent it over to the Senate or whatever it is they're supposed to do.
It's a perfect analogy. Pelosi designed impeachment so that it could have no resolution. It could come to no finish.
Yeah.
And by doing a concurrent resolution instead of a joint resolution with this War Powers Act thing, she's done the same thing. If the Senate were to pass it, where does it go next? It goes to the courthouse. Like, now we're going to litigate whether CHATA applies to the War Powers Act and you can exercise a congressional veto over war powers, blah, blah, blah. And so she would throw it into limbo just like she did with the impeachment.
Yeah, yeah.
But
everything is politics.
It is politics, except for me on this bill. I kind of blurred my eyes and said, well, it's not perfect, but it's one of the very few statements of whether Congress has the authority to go to war or whether the president does that I have had an opportunity to vote on since I've been in Congress. So I'm going to vote for this.
Yeah.
And so I did, and invoking the great memory of my late friend Walter B. Jones Jr. from Florida, from North Carolina. We buried him just last year. Thinking about Walter Jones, he helped me to understand there's going to be 2 times that you're going to be called to account for your activity in Congress. The first time will be your next reelection, and the last time is going to be when you draw your last breath of air.
Yeah.
And so it was thinking about Walter Jones and his conviction to stopping the next war that inspired me to vote for this in large part.
Well, remind everybody what Walter did, because the point that I want to get back to is that, the partisan nature of any debate about war, it seems like everybody rediscovers the Constitution when the other party's guy is in the White House. And Republicans were pretty good about complaining about Barack Obama's unconstitutional wars in Iraq, and we'll probably get into all that. But Walter Jones was the guy that was willing to step up and say, you know what, I made a mistake. Republicans made a mistake by voting to go into Iraq.
Yeah, that was a big step for Walter, and it's virtually unprecedented in politics.
Yeah.
For somebody on a significant vote, like voting on whether to go to war in Iraq, to come out later and say, you know what, I made a big mistake. And Walter didn't just vote for it. He coined this term freedom fries and got some notoriety for it. And then
he was all in.
Yeah, he was all in, and it wasn't like, on the edge sort of vote. And within a few years, and the bodies started coming back, and he represented a Marine base in his district, and he, going and talking to families, he realized he had made a tragic mistake, and that his soul was, in the balance. And he wrote thousands of letters to all of the families who lost a soldier in atonement for that vote. And I had dinner with him almost every week. By the way, neither of us were in the Freedom Caucus, or are in the Freedom Caucus. And so we kind of had the Walter Jones, Thomas Massie caucus because there was nobody else to go to eat with on fly-in day. It was like, we're all the conservatives. Well, we're the only 2, Walter. Well, let's go over to the Capitol Hill Club. And so I I know for a fact that before every meal he prayed about soldiers, and he told me, look, I'm not going to be here much longer. I don't know how he knew he was going to pass away of a rare disease, but I never took him seriously when he said that. But then he would also talk about his mistake in voting for the Iraq War, and he inspired me. He taught me a lot, and he was a true Southern gentleman. And I was the one who delivered his eulogy on the floor of the House. And I asked people, Walter's one wish was that he could have finished his last term, because he would have served for as long as his dad did. And he didn't get to finish that term. And I said, so when you vote, let's help Walter finish his term by thinking to yourself, what would Walter do?
Yeah.
And that's what I was thinking tonight when I voted. Again, it's a resolution that's probably not going to be binding, but it is a vote not to have a war in Iran, and I took the vote not to have a war in Iran.
And it is, it's got to be a step to getting some people at least to understand that there was a time. We'll have to probably go all the way back to Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. There was a time when the United States, that the law of the land, the Constitution, said that it is Congress that declares war. And I want to walk through all that, but let me just give a shout out to you and Walter, other members of Congress. I think the measure sometimes of doing the right thing is your willingness to actually vote against your own party and your own president when the Constitution is at stake. And I think that's where we're at.
Yeah,
and it's got to be a little uncomfortable.
When it is your president and in the White House, it's difficult. The Republicans wouldn't let me speak on the floor today.
Yeah.
So I negotiated with the Democrats to get 1 minute. I said, "Look, this is a tough vote. I'm going to have to explain it."
Yeah.
And they were gracious enough to give me a minute, and that's when I explained this is not the president. I reminded the Democrats in my speech, I voted for Trump, and I plan to vote for him again. So this ain't about him. This is about reclaiming our constitutional authority, but more importantly, our moral obligation to debate when our soldiers are going to be asked to give up their lives.
Yeah. Let's take a step back, because I want people to understand sort of the historical context of why it is that Congress has the authority to declare war and how they've abdicated that for at least my lifetime, and we could probably go back even further. Let's talk a little bit about Article 1, Section 8. It's pretty clear. What does it say?
The power that Congress has the power to declare war, and it gets ignored.
Yeah.
It's pretty much that simple. It's been I think a gradual decline. The founders knew, especially Madison, that it was important to put it in the legislative branch because, number one, kings became more popular during war. Like when you're defending the homeland or expanding your empire, the people like a good war, and everything good that comes from it, that benefit politically ascribes to the executive. And so they knew, number one, it was bad for that reason to let an executive do it. Also, why would you want just one person to be able to declare a war? And finally, the point that I made in my speech, another point that I made in my speech, which the founders well knew, you do not want to go to war. You don't want to send soldiers there unless the soldiers have the support of the people. And it would be very easy for one executive to do something that might not have the support of the people. But it's a lot harder to go to the people's house who are going to be up for election in no more than 2 years and get the authority to go to war. So they wanted to put it in the hands of the people's house. And so that's another reason why it was wise to do that.
And even Alexander Hamilton, who was by far the guy that advocated a strong and robust presidency, even he acknowledged that a president left unchecked would always choose the option of going to war. But I went back and I found a letter from James Madison, and I want to read it because I can't explain it as eloquently as he did. But he said, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies, debts, and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And he's pretty much describing where we've been.
Where we are.
Yeah, where we are today.
Which is
a pretty smart guy. He saw this coming.
I mean, he studied history,
yeah.
Right? It wasn't like he could see the future. He was using empirical data.
Yeah.
Right? That's a fact.
And human nature and what power does to people.
Power corrupts, and that's where we are today. The other thing is we're in this perpetual state of war. We've got an AUMF that authorizes us to go into Afghanistan. And
so let's define these, because you have the 73 Act.
War Powers Act, yeah.
The War Powers Act. And what did that do?
Well, at the time, Congress thought it gave them more power, and the president vetoed it. And they had to override his veto to pass it. But it's actually pretty lenient compared to what a strict reading of the Constitution says.
Yeah, so it weakened, in a sense.
I think it diluted what was in plain English in the Constitution and what the founders had debated.
Yeah.
But the executive at the time thought it was giving Congress more power to stop him.
Yeah.
And so there's some debate over whether it was a wise thing. There's some debate over whether it's constitutional. There's the provision in it that's got the congressional veto where you can pass a concurrent resolution and not even send it to the president and basically claw back the president from a war that he's put his toe into, which is sort of a really hard thing to do politically, even if you can do it. I mean, imagine if today the Soleimani thing, the response to that had transpired differently, and we were trading missiles with Iran between either Israel or because they can't reach our country right now, or some base, some military base of importance to us, and Iran. Let's say we're trading missiles. Do you think Congress could go and claw back, get us out of that war politically? Hell no. You say you don't support the troops; they're dying over there. You gotta support. There'd be even Democrats saying support this.
And by the way, the abdication of this clear congressional responsibility is in part driven by political cowardice. They don't want to be accountable for when war goes bad, and war almost always goes bad.
Yeah.
And body bags start coming home, and whatever the original enthusiasm was for the war, the American people start saying, wait, why are we doing this?
So, in my Twitter feed tonight, I posted my speech, and I saw one of the common themes, refrains, objections to my statement that if we're going to send our men and women to die, we owe it to them to debate it in Congress and show they have the support of the people, because ultimately we're going to have to fund it too. And the common objection I see to that is, oh my gosh, you guys are such idiots. And you can never decide anything. If we left it up to you, it would take 6 months to declare a war. Well, maybe in the case where war is ambiguous, the need for war is ambiguous, maybe it's a good thing that we get into this metastable state and never come out with a resolution to declare war. Now, in the case of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, it didn't take but 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever it was, to declare war. So number one, their objection is wrong. Like if you look at the last time we actually declared war, right? A real declaration of war.
World War II.
World War II. That came like that. And I think there was only one objection to it, right? Then if you look at all the wars that we're into, if we, without congressional authorization, there were a couple of them where we've done AUMFs, right, which is something short of that, which is in itself not a good idea, but at least it's Congress having a say and owning it, okay? Sort of owning it, right? Only, like for the AUMFs that were passed in 2001 and 2002, that authorized the war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq.
Authorization for the use of military force.
Yeah. For those, only about 15% of the people that voted for those are still in Congress or the Senate. And so think about that.
So we can't hold them accountable.
No, the 85% of them are already retired and drawing a pension, okay? Or lobbyists in D.C. How are you going to hold them accountable? There was no goal in the AUMF that was articulated. In the case of the first AUMF that authorized the so-called war on terror, there was no boundary, not just in time, but in space. You can go literally anywhere on the globe under the auspice of fighting terror and be covered by the 2001 AUMF. So,
and that was passed right after the attack, the 9/11 attacks.
Right in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. By the way, it was either today or yesterday. When you're in Congress, this stuff just sort of melts together until you can leave and go back to your home state and recharge your batteries. But it was either yesterday or today that I re-upped my co-sponsorship of Democrat Barbara Lee's bill to repeal the AUMF in Iraq. Okay. Now, the thing is, we were talking about the executive always tends to war.
Mm-hmm.
And once you get your toe in a war, it's hard to get out. The other thing is, once you have troops everywhere, now you've created all these targets, and they all need to be defended. They absolutely need to be defended. But now you've created another opportunity to get into a war. Like in Iraq, we've got all of our troops still there, even though Saddam's been gone for a long time. And so when anybody attacks those troops, we've got to attack them back. We absolutely have to protect our troops. But the problem is the troops shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
The way to stop a proxy war with Iran in Iraq from morphing and metastasizing into a full-on hot war between two countries or multiple countries is not to be in Iraq. By the way, it's not just the military bases that create this nexus. You realize we built an embassy in Iraq. It's the biggest one in the world. It's 104 acres. The original price tag was $750 million. So I'm going to go ahead and say it was $1 billion. Nothing ever gets done on time or at cost in government. We've got $1 billion, 100-acre embassy in Iraq. I call it the world's largest boat anchor. I think the don't write me off for saying deep state, but the deep state, okay, knew they could get funding to build an embassy, right? Who's gonna? It's diplomacy, right? We're gonna move from war to diplomacy. So let's build. We need a lot of diplomacy. So let's build one that's 3 times the size of our embassy in China, okay? And so they built this boat anchor, and what it does is you got to protect your embassies, right? We've seen what happens in Benghazi.
Yeah.
But can you imagine trying what it takes to defend, or even what the frickin' light bill is on a 104-acre embassy with thousands of people in it? Okay, so that cemented our political and military involvement in Iraq for many years against the wishes of the American people.
And, the irony is, and I think you pointed this out on Twitter, so you have Soleimani, who's clearly a bad guy, clearly a murderous monster. I'm not sure he won't be replaced by somebody even worse. I assume there's an infinite number of murderous monsters that would be available to the Iranian government to do whatever it is they want to accomplish. But he's flying in and out of Iraq without any problems, and you wonder what happens after all this treasure and all of these American lives that we've spent liberating Iraq from terrorist organizations. They appear to be pretty much controlled, or at least in cahoots with Iran.
Yeah, well, there's twice as many Shia in Iraq as there are Sunnis. And Iran is a predominantly Shia nation. It's a natural thing for a Shia government, dominated government or parliament or whatever, to evolve in Iraq. Like, it was sort of an anomaly to have somebody like Saddam, and he was a dictator, but he was a minority, and he was keeping that country together. He kept the Shias from dominating the government there. And I mean, there were far more Christians in Iraq before we went there and tore the whole place apart and deposed and then killed Saddam Hussein. And what we did is we created a vacuum, first for ISIS to take over, and now for Iran to take over. I mean, that's one of the ways that Soleimani built his political base in Iraq, was he was helping to take out ISIS. But ISIS was occupying a vacuum that we created.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what sort of framework you can set up in Iraq, as long as Iran is still a country, that Iran won't have influence in, now that we've taken them out.
So you're saying that nation building in Iraq didn't work?
It didn't work there. I challenge somebody to show me somewhere it has worked.
What an amazing sort of arrogance and pretense that and neoconservatives, they want to go to all these wars, and the presumption is that we can sort of export American style democracy
Jeffersonian,
and rule of law.
They're going to have these guys in white wigs with powder on.
What are they smoking?
I don't know where you can get what they're smoking.
Yeah.
They sell that to the American people, right? I don't think the people who are architecting this themselves believe that. I mean, like Afghanistan, I've talked to the Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, and he's described Afghanistan as 12th century with rifles. Like, that's sort of where they're at right now. But an interesting thing is I talked to a constituent of mine yesterday, called in, was talking to one of my staffers. I said, "Is that a constituent?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, and she was talking about war. I'm pretty sure she was a Democrat. I said, "Let me talk to the constituent." I didn't know if it was going to be, I call this roulette, right? Like, you do not know when you pick up the phone, and you don't know what the conversation is, what you're going to get. But I had a constituent who wanted to make sure we didn't go to war in Iran. I'm pretty sure she didn't vote for me and never will vote for me, but I was sympathetic to her position. But she had been in the Peace Corps from 1968 to 1971 in Afghanistan. And she said you could go anywhere. They were the kindest people. She was helping give vaccinations, not to trigger the vaccination debate here, but
we won't go there.
Okay, let's don't do that. But she was there doing that, and with the support of the people.
We're pissing off enough people just talking about what we're talking about.
But my point is this: it wasn't a modern country then. I don't want you to think like we've moved them backward.
Yeah.
She didn't, she said there was a lot of infant mortality, and, but she said 15, 20, 30 years later, people describe that as the golden age in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Where people then weren't in fear of their lives or some dictatorship or some oppressive theocracy.
So 18 years in Afghanistan, slightly less in Iraq, trillions of dollars. I now forget how many American lives have been lost. And things are worse than they were when we went after terrorism. Is that an overstatement?
It's not an overstatement. I think it's accurate. And the worst part of that, even if we don't want to litigate the past and blame, if we step away from blaming the people that made those mistakes, the question is, what do you do going forward, right? I wasn't in Congress. I'd like to think I wouldn't have voted for them, but I don't know. I wasn't here.
Yeah.
But I'm here now. So what do we do going forward? Well, we owe it to the troops who are still there, still fighting, to define a mission that they can accomplish so they can come home. Like, even the people who are excited about the fact that President Trump took out Soleimani are not excited about staying in Iraq or staying in Afghanistan or starting another war in Iran. That's the thing I've come to realize in the last couple of weeks. My first thought when I saw all the celebration over the president's conquest over this bad guy, okay, was that my first thought was, oh my gosh, people like war. But what I realized when I started posting and interacting with people and talking to people is, no, they like the fact that the president took out Soleimani, but they want to get us out of Iraq. Like, the same people who are happy about that say, yeah, get our troops home.
Yeah.
So,
well, Iraq agrees with us now. They want us to leave. So
right, the parliament did, and then people say, well, but the Kurds and the Sunnis didn't show up for the vote. Well, you know what? Guess what? If they did, they would have lost anyway. Like, it's a Shia majority country, and they, just like America, there's a sentiment even among the people that like America, that of pride, national pride, that they want to be a sovereign country. They don't want to be a puppet.
Yeah.
And they know that when we come in and do things and take over and make their government look like a pretend government, because now we're running things for a week or two, they know that is not good for the future of the country.
And by the way, Americans would never tolerate a scenario like that where a foreign nation was pulling the strings and calling the shots.
None of this passes the golden rule, which is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It doesn't. The stuff we get away with on smaller countries wouldn't even pass muster if you did it to China or Russia, right?
Right.
Like, it's only because we can dominate those countries that we are able to do these things, and it's accepted as, okay, well, we did it. Like, can you imagine if it were Russia or China that we were having sort of escalating these proxy wars with? It'd be a whole different ballgame, which, by the way, gets me to a point I really wanted to make tonight. We are 10% of the world's population, and we dominate the whole globe. And we do it by having the baddest ass military in the world with the best technology. We still, for a little bit longer, got the best manufacturing. Like, if you want quality stuff, made in USA is the best. And so our foreign policy is, we do what we want because we can, and nobody can challenge that. Long before CO2 is an issue on this planet, okay, we're going to have to come up with a new business model for getting along with the other 90% of the world's population, because they're catching up technologically. If we ever got into a war that involved manufacturing prowess, it's questionable right now whether we can keep up with some of these other countries. I mean, in World War II, you had Frigidaire making machine guns and General Motors making, guns and tanks and Ford. We don't really have that kind of base right now, or to the extent we do have it, other countries have more of it themselves now. So what I'm saying here is that our business model, so to speak, for getting along with the rest of the world needs to become something other than we got a military that can kick your ass, and so we're going to do what we want. That model will fly for another 20, maybe 50 years.
Yeah.
But at some point, the billion plus people that live in China and the billion plus people that live in India are going to contest the 300 million plus people that live in the United States on that sort of issue, just by catching up with us technologically and manufacturing wise. And look, I don't want anybody other than us to have a nuclear weapon, frankly. Okay, but eventually we're going to live in a world where they do. It's going to happen. And so, number one, we need to start being nice to some of these people. And number two, we need to work on our missile defense system.
Yeah.
Like, instead of going off and going out and doing stuff to other countries, I think we need to be back here sharpening the sword that allows us to prevent other countries from doing things to us. One of the reasons we are so prosperous and we got such a head start on all these other countries is after we kicked their asses and got them off of our island, which was essentially North America at the time. It was just too much trouble for them to come and mess with us, right? The ocean was such a barrier. We don't have another place we can go and do that again. And with travel and hypersonic missiles, that ocean it becomes less and less of a barrier and a safety factor.
I've always wondered why it is that Democrats and the establishment in the swamp were so opposed to missile defense as an alternative to going off to war and nation building and all that stuff. But imagine the sort of defense system we could have built with the cost of basically buying and rebuilding Afghanistan alone. Forget the embassy in Iraq.
Imagine if of the $750 billion we spend on defense every year, we took 200 or 300 billion of that instead of keeping 30,000 people, soldiers in Japan and 25,000 in Korea, and then tens of thousands in the Middle East and this many in Germany. Instead of doing that, we are going to spend it on missile defense. Like, I'm an engineer, okay? I know these are hard problems to solve, but I know they're solvable. And we could make the fact that Iran could get a nuclear weapon, or North Korea could get a nuclear weapon, or the fact that China has nuclear weapons, or that Russia has nuclear weapons, we could make that a moot point with technology that we could develop in a few short years. And honestly, that's what we should be doing. Now, at the time, I know people opposed it back in the 80s. They made fun of Reagan for Star Wars and blah, blah, blah. A lot of stuff that was a stretch then is possible now. And one of the reasons some people opposed it back then is they said it was actually an escalation, not a de-escalation. They said if you build something that can stop that weapon coming from the Soviet Union, then that'll only encourage them to build a different or a bigger or better weapon. But I much prefer a strong defense to an offense that can be taken out by any first world country. So, for instance, like aircraft carriers. They are, in some sense, obsolete in a war with China or Russia at this point. Like, they are sitting ducks. Or with the technology they have. They let us project power right now into Iran, into Iraq, and North Korea for a little bit longer. But for, first world countries, it doesn't work. they're going the way of castles, right? Like castles. By the way, our embassy in Iraq is like a castle, but castles became obsolete as soon as, well, number one, it was rifling in a barrel that defeated castles. Like if you're just throwing stuff at a castle, the wall gets thicker when it hits. But if you've got rifling in your barrel, you can go through it. And then castles absolutely became obsolete when people could get up in the air and drop crap on them, right? So that's where aircraft carriers are going right now. Obsolescence.
Well, the other problem with Empire is that it's really expensive. And I want to go back to Madison. He talked almost immediately about the debt and the taxes involved with, he didn't use the word endless war until the end of that quote, but he's talking about what happens when governments get into too many wars and they spend too much money. And I'm thinking a little bit about where are we at now? 22 trillion?
But that's such an antiquated notion because he couldn't control interest rates at the time.
Yeah,
and now we've evolved.
We can expand money and credit
right.
and just pay it to ourselves.
Could he have foreseen a Federal Reserve that could actually set the interest rates for most of the world?
Yeah, he's spinning in his grave right now.
He is spinning in his grave because that's another kind of tax. So he's still right.
Yeah.
By the way, I had the most surreal moment in one of these classified briefings, again, yesterday or day before. This stuff melts in your head. We had the CIA director there. We had the Secretary of State. We had the Director of National Intelligence. We had the whole crew there. And these are mostly useless briefings. And they're pretty arrogant, by the way. It's kind of perfunctory, right? But the surreal moment I had is when I watched a Democrat. You could go to the microphone and they would alternate between Republican and Democrat, and members of Congress could ask direct questions to the panel. Democrat got up and started talking about how we've only got 2 active aircraft carriers in the Middle East, and the law prescribes that we need to have 3, and what we're going to do about the readiness of our aircraft carriers, and asking the general who was on the stage about this crisis that we just don't have enough aircraft carriers. And I turned to my colleague to the right, Ben Klein, love this guy. He's from Virginia. And I said, is she from the district that makes aircraft carriers? And he was a Democrat, and he's nodded. He said, yep. So that tells you, like, when you get behind closed doors, it really doesn't matter whether you got an R or D on your lapel. If your district stands to benefit from the military-industrial complex, you see that as your mission is to keep it going.
Yeah. And I always oversimplified described this $22 trillion in debt. There used to be this theoretical trade-off between guns and butter, and Republicans were for fully funding the military, which is impossible because it's a black hole. And, of course, the Democrats want to fully fund the social safety net, which is also impossible because it's a black hole. But there used to be some sort of squabble between the two, and they'd split the difference, and they'd try to sort of come up with something that sort of reduced the deficit and came into balance. But the trade-off after 9/11 has been, I'll fund all of your military if you fund all of my social safety net stuff. And nobody seems to care anymore about spending. But the aspect you bring up is also relevant, that it's bringing pork back to the district is not a partisan thing. It could be a Democrat, it could be a Republican. A Republican could replace a Democrat, and in a lot of ways they just do the same thing because we need 3 aircraft carriers. It's the law.
Right. Yeah. I remember. Ironically, it was Trump's now acting chief of staff who was his acting OMB director who is this acting CFPP director.
He's doing all that stuff.
Yeah. Mick Mulvaney, every year he would offer an amendment. I think it's either 12 or 11. Congress sets by law the number of aircraft carriers the Navy has to have. In spite of what the admirals want, Congress says, damn it, you're going to have, and I forget if it's 12 or 11 or 10, you're going to have this many aircraft carriers. And Mick Mulvaney would always offer an amendment, and I would always vote for it, that said, you know what, we're not going to reduce the amount of money the Navy gets. We're just going to reduce this requirement by one. So instead of having to have like 11 aircraft carriers, they can just have 10. And do you know which organization scored against that and came? You probably do. In their annual scorecard, they would say you were not a conservative if you voted for Mick Mulvaney's amendment. Literally, out of the 10 most important votes that year, they would pick Mick Mulvaney's amendment as a threat to conservatives.
Is this Heritage?
It was Heritage.
Yeah. I see. I vaguely remember that, but it was a.
By the way, I don't want to pick on Heritage. They do a lot of good stuff. I usually have like an 85% score with Heritage and a 95% score with FreedomWorks, and whatever. But I say Heritage is wrong 15% of the time, and FreedomWorks is wrong 5% of the time. If I've got 95%, blah, blah.
Well, because you're the gold standard.
That's right.
Yeah.
So anyways,
the Massie standard.
That's one. Honestly, that's one they need called out on.
Yeah.
And that's Trump's now chief of staff who offered that amendment every year.
But that's the Achilles heel, and I remember
it never passed. By the way,
having all of these budget fights, and the Achilles heel for fiscally conservative Republicans was the need to fully fund the military. And I still don't know what that means, but they always took a dive because they needed to do that. It was a religion. So
in these annual omnibus events, they would bring us down into the basement there at the Capitol at HC5, where you have your conference meeting. And they would give us talking points to go back to the district and explain our votes. And they were asking conservatives to walk the plank and vote for the omnibus. And every talking point they gave had to do with increased military spending. And I joked that they were giving us all a banjo with one string on it and no frets.
Yeah.
And said, go play this one string banjo with no frets to your constituents.
Yeah, go sing a song, One Note Johnny.
It was the military string. There was none of the other strings on the banjo and no opportunity to make a chord or anything. It was crazy, but what is a one string banjo with no strings and frets? It's a drum. They would basically say, go beat this drum, right?
Yeah. Well, so we're picking on conservatives and Republicans, and you said something earlier that I think is worth revisiting, because I don't think this is about Donald Trump, and I have to give a shout out for his restraint, and he, the downside is he's surrounded himself with guys like Pompeo, and I feel like the ghost of the guy with the mustache is still there. I've forgotten his name, John Bolton. He's lurking somewhere in the background.
His mustache is still there.
But I still think that Trump's instinct is restraint, and I also think that we haven't spent much time here sort of calling out Barack Obama's hypocrisy and his expansion of executive war powers. He pretty much created a scenario, particularly with Libya, but the drone strikes, 450 or something like that.
On individual people that were targeted,
yeah.
Right? These were people with names. These weren't like military enclaves or militias. It was like, we're taking out this dude, and we got a drone with a missile with that dude's name on it. And Obama delivered those 500, drone strikes. By the way, I try to be an honorable person, and I would never disclose in a private conversation what somebody said to me, but I feel at liberty to say what I've said to other people. The president called me today on this vote and made actually a pretty good case for why it wouldn't be a good vote. That he made the case that he could do a better job of preventing war without having his hands tied. And it was a pretty compelling case. Didn't compel me all the way. Again, I'm just saying all that vaguely. I'm not giving you specific things. But the thing that I told him is I thanked him. And I told him, I said, you know what? You're the first president so far in my lifetime that hasn't started a war. Like, and it's true.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. You know, and he said, you're right. You know, he does not want another war. I believe that based on personal conversations with him. Again, I'm not going to tell you what specifically he said to me about that. But I believe he doesn't want a war with Iran. I believe he's using the Ronald Reagan strategy of peace through superior firepower. And so I thanked him for not starting another war. It's almost unheard of in the presidents in modern history.
Yeah. And Barack Obama, for all of his
let's talk about Obama.
Yeah, for all of his anti-war rhetoric.
Yeah, because he wanted to go to war in 2013 against Syria. And I remember this very distinctly. And John Kerry had said they'd crossed the red line, blah, blah, blah. Obama said, well, I'll go to Congress. And Pelosi said, yes, we'll pass your war. And Boehner, yes, we'll pass your war. But it took like about a week to get the resolution drafted. And in that period of time, I received 100 phone calls a day against the war. Now, I usually receive about 5 phone calls a day. Like if you went back over the last 7 years I've been in Congress, the average would be 3, 4 to 20 phone calls would be a lot of phone calls in a day. Okay. So to get 100 phone calls a day, 6 days in a row was a big deal. And I knew all my colleagues were getting it. Americans in 2013 did not want to go to war.
In Syria.
In Syria. By the way, I also introduced the War Powers Protection Act, right? It's very similar to what the Democrats did today. So when people say, oh, well, you were all, you never criticized Obama. You only decided to be against war when Trump became president. Like I just it's on congress.gov. I introduced these bills, right? I got the YouTubes. Go watch them. I opposed it. My constituents opposed it. So what actually happened is that was like August, September. There was a government shutdown, and people forgot, thank goodness for Obama and the Democrats, because there was no support for it. We never passed an authorization. And then what Congress did is they secretly funded, and I'm pretty sure most of my colleagues didn't even know they were voting for omnibuses and CRs that secretly funded a war in Syria, because Justin Amash and I, like other than the two of us, I never saw more than 5 other people go to the SCIF and read the classified section of the budget. And so anyways, there was, funding, and I can tell you this because it was in the New York Times, not because I was in the SCIF looking at it.
So it must be true.
It must be true. I think even the Mike Pompeo has talked about this. He's the Secretary of State now. It must be true. And then that little secret war, which, by the way, ISIS quickly evolved. ISIS wasn't a thing. There was money going in to fund, as John McCain called them, moderate rebels and weapons. And like I've asked in a hearing, I asked somebody, can you tell me, did we fund ISIS? They wouldn't answer. Like, it's classified, blah, blah. So, we sort of like fomented what became ISIS in 2013. Obama wanted his fingers in all that stuff. I mean, and they were funneling through Libya. I mean, Iran was great at pointing this out. Arms into Syria. And, he did the war in Libya. That was before I got there. I can't speak to that. But I know in 2013 exactly how things transpired. And then eventually they put boots on the ground. By the way, the Democrats, I'm not going to say all of the Democrats, but a lot of the Democrats look the other way.
Sure.
There are some, I want to give a shout out to the Democrats who I know have true convictions and have always been against even Obama's wars, like Barbara Lee.
Yeah.
Okay. I know she's got true convictions.
And she's your co-sponsor on repeal of
the AUMF,
the 2002 AUMF.
Right, the one in Iraq.
Yeah.
She's been a consistent voice. Like, these are the rare examples I'm giving you, right? Ro Khanna, who's recently come to Congress, he wasn't here for Syria. He's been a fairly consistent voice. Tulsi Gabbard has been a consistent voice against war. But the sad thing is, like, I'm not naming them all, but if I had time and could look stuff up, I could name them all, and they probably fit on both hands.
You wouldn't run out of fingers.
I wouldn't run out of fingers.
Yeah.
And I don't have extra fingers. I've got 10 like everybody else. Of the number of Democrats who were willing to criticize Obama in the way that they're willing to criticize Trump now.
Yeah. And that to me is depressing, but that story, and let's wrap up with this because I think it's important to understand what Madison and Hamilton had in mind when Barack Obama went to Congress and wanted authorization to go into Syria. You talked to your constituents and they said no, and you said no, and that should have been the end of the story.
Right.
But then they did an end run around it and funded it secretly.
Right. But it is a success story in some regard. Like, I think it would be a full-blown war in Syria. Like, let's say Obama could have gone to war in Syria, full-on war, put boots on the ground in 2013. We would be having the sort of proxy war with Iran and Russia that we're having in Iraq today. But I think it would have been much hotter because you would still have a leader who's not deposed yet. You would still have Assad. And it could have been much worse. There could have been, like, with Iraq and Afghanistan, where we've lost together in both of those conflicts at least 5,000 soldiers. There could have been thousands of men and women who died in Syria if Obama had gotten his way and done a full-on hot war, boots on the ground war in Syria. And it didn't happen because Congress pushed back. Now, there was the little end run where you did our proxy war, right, with secret money, okay? Yeah. But this is the wisdom. Like, when people say, no, Congress never makes up their mind. It would take them months, maybe years to decide to go to war. Well, that's what happened in Syria, and that's why thousands of lives, American lives, weren't lost in Syria. And so that's an example of the wisdom of Madison. Now, you could also try to give credit to Obama, but to take that away, he was doing as much end run as he could, and he eventually put boots on the ground. And he did as much as he could get away with.
Yeah. And by the way, the wisdom of the American people, which supposedly is the American system. We believe in the wisdom of the American people. And well, let's wrap up because we could go on all night about the good, the bad, and the ugly of foreign policy. But I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and I appreciate you sticking your neck out when it's not comfortable. But my prediction is you're going to go back to your district and find people that appreciate what you've done. So come back and tell us how that goes.
All right, I'll let you know how that goes. I'm, you know, I want to finish with a tribute to my friend Walter Jones, who passed away last year. I'm going to be judged twice on my activities in Congress. Once in my next election, and once when I draw my last breath of air. And it's the second one that guides me more so than the first one.
Words to live by. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.